The wind carried nothing but dust and the promise of another scorching day across the barren stretch of New Mexico territory. Samuel Hartwell pulled his hat low over his weathered face as he guided his horse along what barely passed for a road, little more than wheel ruts carved into hardpan by the occasional supply wagon. Behind him, a pack mule struggled under the weight of his possessions. A few tools, some clothes, a rifle, and precious little else. Everything a man needed to disappear. He reckoned the land stretched endless in all directions, broken only by the occasional mesa rising like a fortress from the desert floor. Sagebrush and prickly pear dotted the landscape, tough plants that knew how to survive where gentler things would wither and die. It reminded Samuel of himself, stubborn, scarred, and determined to endure where others couldn't. He'd bought the ranch site unseen from a man in Santa Fe who seemed eager to be rid of it. $37 for 160 acres, the fellow had said, practically shoving the deed across the table. House, barn, well, and whatever else is out there. The man's eyes had darted away when he mentioned whatever else. But Samuel hadn't cared enough to ask. He wanted isolation, and isolation was what this place promised. The sun hung merciless overhead when he finally spotted the buildings. A weathered adobe house with a sagging porch, a lean-to barn that had seen better decades, and a corral with half its posts missing. It wasn't much, but it was his. More importantly, it was nowhere. No neighbors to ask questions about where he'd come from or why he'd left everything behind. No familiar faces to remind him of better times. Before the fever took Martha and little James. Before the world turned cold and empty. Samuel dismounted and stood surveying his new domain. The silence was complete except for the whisper of wind through the sparse grass and the creak of old wood settling in the heat. His horse nickered softly, eager for water after the long ride from town. The well, when he found it, still held sweet water, a small blessing in this harsh country. He set about the work that would fill his days from now on. The corral needed rebuilding. The barn required new supports, and the house, well, the house would do for a man who didn't expect much from life anymore. The adobe walls were thick enough to keep out the worst of the heat, and the roof, though patched in places, didn't leak. It was more shelter than many had in this territory, as the days turned into weeks. Samuel fell into a rhythm that suited his need for solitude. He rose before dawn to tend his horse and the 2 cattle he'd bought from a passing rancher. The work was hard but honest. Mending fence, hauling stones, clearing brush. His hands, soft from years behind a store counter back in Missouri, grew calloused and strong. The sun darkened his skin and bleached his hair, marking him as a man of the desert. Evenings found him sitting on the porch, watching the sky paint itself in shades of orange and purple as the sun sank behind the distant mountains. Sometimes he would remember Martha's laugh, or the way young James would chase fireflies in their garden back home. But those memories came less often now, pushed down by the simple exhaustion of survival and the vast emptiness that surrounded him. The loneliness was a living thing, sharp as winter wind when it chose to bite. But Samuel welcomed it. Loneliness was honest, at least. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't or promise things it couldn't deliver. It simply was. Like the desert itself, harsh, unforgiving, but clean in its brutal simplicity. He learned the moods of his new home, the way the wind picked up before a storm, carrying the scent of distant rain, how the temperature could drop 30 degrees when the sun disappeared behind clouds, where to find shelter when the occasional flash flood turned dry washes into raging torrents. The desert was teaching him its lessons, and he was a willing student. At night, he would sit by his small fire, listening to the coyotes sing their wild songs to the stars. The sound no longer seemed mournful to him, just another voice in the wilderness, another creature making its way in a world that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. Sometimes he thought he understood what they were saying, that survival was its own reward, that asking for more than that was the beginning of disappointment. The nearest neighbor was 3 days' ride to the east, and Samuel intended to keep it that way. when supply wagons occasionally rumbled past on their way to mining camps in the mountains. He would watch from his porch but make no move to flag them down. He had enough flour and beans to last, and the well provided all the water he needed. What more could a man want who had already lost everything that mattered? Winter came early that year, bringing snow that transformed the brown landscape into something almost beautiful. Samuel spent those months close to his fire, mending harness and reading the few books he'd brought from his old life. The Bible, mostly, though the words seemed different now than they had when Martha used to read them aloud on Sunday mornings. Harsher, somehow, but perhaps more honest too. Spring returned with its promise of renewal, though Samuel felt little of that hope himself. He was simply here, existing, marking time in a place where time moved differently than it did in the world of men. The desert didn't care about his past or his future. It only demanded that he survive each day, and that was a challenge he found he could meet as he worked to repair the winter's damage to his small domain. Samuel began to understand that he had found what he was looking for. Not happiness. That was a luxury for people who still believed in such things. But peace of a sort. The peace that came from expecting nothing and receiving exactly that. The peace of a man who had made his bargain with solitude and found the terms acceptable. The ranch in the middle of nowhere had become his world, and he was content to let it remain so. After all, there was nowhere else he wanted to go, and nothing left behind worth remembering. This was enough. This was home. It was on a Tuesday morning in late spring that Samuel's carefully ordered solitude came to an abrupt end. The kind of morning that started like any other. Coffee boiled over the fire, the sound of his boots on wooden floors, the familiar creak of the front door as he stepped out to check on his animals. But something was different. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck prickle with the same instinct that warned of approaching storms. Smoke was rising from his chimney. Samuel stopped dead in his tracks, one boot still on the porch step. He'd banked his fire before going out to the barn. As he did every morning, there should be no smoke, no flame, no sign of life in his house save for his own return. Yet there it was, a thin gray line climbing straight up into the still morning air. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle he always carried, fingers wrapping around the familiar stock. In this country, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble, and trouble often came armed. He'd heard stories from the occasional supply wagon drivers about bandits, renegade Indians, and worse, men who'd gone wild in the emptiness and lost all sense of decency. The front door stood slightly ajar, though he was certain he'd closed it firmly behind him. Samuel approached with the careful step of a hunter, placing each boot deliberately to avoid the boards he knew would creak. Through the gap in the door, he could see the glow of his fireplace, hear the soft pop and hiss of burning wood. What he hadn't expected was the humming. It was a woman's voice, low and sweet, carrying a tune he didn't recognize, but that spoke of places far from this desolate stretch of desert. The sound stopped him more effectively than a gunshot would have. In all his months of isolation, he'd grown so accustomed to silence that the human voice seemed almost supernatural. Samuel pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle and stepped inside, ready for anything except what he found. She was young, maybe 20, perhaps a year or two older, with dark hair braided down her back and a face that would have been called pretty in polite society. But there was nothing polite about the way she stood beside his fireplace, poker in hand, looking at him with eyes that held no fear. She wore a simple brown dress that had seen hard use, and boots that were practical rather than fashionable. Most unsettling of all, she looked at him as if she'd been expecting him. "You must be Samuel Hartwell," she said, setting the poker aside with deliberate calm. "I was wondering when you'd get around to coming inside." Samuel kept his rifle trained on her, though something about her manner made him feel foolish for doing so. "Who are you? What are you doing in my house?" "My name is Clara Whitmore." She moved to the small table where she'd apparently been preparing breakfast. His breakfast, from the look of it, made with his supplies. "As for what I'm doing here, I suppose that's a matter of some debate." "No debate about it. This is my land, bought and paid for. You're trespassing." Clara smiled, and there was something in that expression that reminded Samuel of his late wife when she'd made up her mind about something. "I've been living here for 8 months. Mr. Hartwell, long before you showed up with your deed and your grand plans for solitude. This house has been my home longer than it's been yours." The simple statement hit Samuel like a physical blow. 8 months. She'd been here when he bought the place, which meant the man who sold it to me. He knew. Mr. Patterson knew. Yes, I expect he thought I'd run off when a new owner showed up. Most young women would have. Clara turned back to the pan where bacon was beginning to sizzle. "But I'm not most young women, and I have nowhere else to go." Samuel lowered his rifle but didn't set it aside completely. The situation was unlike anything he'd prepared for. "You can't just stay. This isn't how these things work." "And how do they work exactly?" Clara asked, turning to face him with a spatula in her hand. "Do you plan to throw me out by force, drag me off the property and dump me on the road to town? Because I should warn you, Mr. Hartwell, I'll be back before nightfall. This is my home." There was steel in her voice, the kind of determination Samuel had heard in the voices of men facing down impossible odds. It was the sound of someone who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. He recognized it because he'd heard it in his own voice often enough. "Why here?" he asked finally, setting his rifle against the wall but staying near the door. "Of all the places in the territory, why this one?" Clara's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained guarded. "Same reason as you, I'd guess. It's nowhere. No one comes looking for people in nowhere." She turned back to the stove, but Samuel caught the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand trembled slightly as she turned the bacon. "I needed somewhere to disappear, and this place seemed perfect for it." Samuel studied her profile, noting the stubborn set of her jaw and the way she held herself, proud despite whatever circumstances had driven her to take refuge in an abandoned house in the middle of the desert. There was a story there, one that probably involved the kind of trouble he'd come here to avoid. "You've been living here alone? All winter?" "I have." Clara's voice carried a note of pride. "I trapped rabbits, gathered what I could find, made do with what was already here. I'm not helpless." "Mr. Hartwell, despite what my appearance might suggest," looking around the house with fresh eyes, Samuel began to notice changes he'd attributed to his own efforts. The floors were cleaner than they should have been, the windows clear of dust, the shelves organized in a way that spoke of a woman's touch. Even the kindling beside the fireplace was neatly stacked, something he'd been too tired to notice when he first arrived. "You've been taking care of the place," he said, more to himself than to her. "I've been living here," Clara corrected. "And yes, I take care of what's mine. It's not yours." She turned to look at him directly, and Samuel saw something in her eyes that made him step back involuntarily. It wasn't anger, exactly, or even defiance. It was the look of someone who had found the one thing in the world worth fighting for and had no intention of giving it up without a battle. "Then prove it," she said quietly. "Show me where in that deed of yours it says anything about a young woman with nowhere else to go. Show me the part that gives you the right to turn someone out into the desert to die." Samuel felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I'm not turning you out to die. There's a town where I'll do what, exactly? Work in a saloon? Find some man to take care of me in exchange for services?" Clara's voice remained level, but there was fire behind her words. "I've seen what towns offer women like me, Mr. Hartwell. I've seen what men offer. I'll take my chances with the desert. Thank you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Samuel found himself looking at her with new eyes, seeing past the simple dress and practical manner to the story written in the careful way she moved, the guarded expression that never quite left her face. Someone had hurt her, badly enough to drive her to this desperate refuge. "I came here to be alone," he said finally. "So did I." Clara lifted the pan from the fire and divided the bacon onto 2 plates. "Seems we both made a mistake." She set one plate on the table and took the other to the chair beside the fireplace. settling into it as if she'd done so 1,000 times before, which, Samuel realized, she probably had. "This is my house," he said again, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "Yes," Clara agreed, taking a bite of bacon. "And I'm the woman who refuses to leave it. Seems like we have ourselves a problem, Mr. Hartwell." Samuel stared at her. This unexpected presence who had shattered his carefully constructed solitude with nothing more than her stubborn refusal to be driven away. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending dust devils dancing across his land, their land, apparently, whether he liked it or not, for the first time since Martha's death. Samuel Hartwell found himself completely at a loss for what to do next. The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm that neither Samuel nor Clara acknowledged, but both seemed to understand. They moved around each other like dancers who had never learned the same steps, careful not to collide, maintaining a distance that felt safe for two people who had both been wounded by the world. Samuel rose before dawn, as had been his habit, but now he dressed quietly in the small bedroom, mindful that Clara slept on a pallet near the fireplace. He would slip out to tend the animals while she still lay beneath the worn quilt she'd somehow acquired during her months alone. By the time he returned for breakfast, she would be dressed and moving about the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had learned to make the most of limited resources. They ate in silence, the scrape of forks against tin plates the only sound between them. Clara had taken to preparing meals for two without consultation or fanfare, simply doubling whatever she had been making for herself. Samuel found himself both grateful and resentful of the gesture. Grateful because her cooking was considerably better than his own rough attempts. Resentful because it implied a permanence to their arrangement that he wasn't ready to accept. After breakfast, they would retreat to their separate territories, Samuel to the corral and barn, where he continued the endless work of building a functional ranch from the bones of an abandoned dream. Clara to the small garden plot she had somehow coaxed from the stubborn desert soil, or to whatever mysterious tasks kept her occupied inside the house. The work suited them both. Samuel found himself throwing his energy into projects that had seemed less urgent when he lived alone. The corral fence that had been adequate for 2 cattle suddenly demanded proper corner posts and tight wire. The barn roof that had merely needed to keep the rain off his horse now required careful attention to every loose board and gap. Clara, for her part, had transformed the neglected vegetable garden into something approaching productivity. Samuel would catch glimpses of her bent over the rows of beans and squash, her hands gentle with the tender plants, but fierce in her war against weeds and pests. She had a way with growing things that spoke of long practice and genuine skill. It was in the small details that their shared existence began to take shape. Samuel would find his shirts mended and hanging on a peg he didn't remember installing. Clara would discover fresh meat hanging in the cool cellar, rabbits or the occasional chicken that had wandered too far from someone's distant farm. Neither acknowledged these gifts directly, but both understood their meaning. The water bucket never seemed to empty when Clara was washing. Samuel made sure of that, hauling water from the well in the gray hours before dawn when the air was cool and the work easy. In return, he would find his coffee prepared exactly as he liked it, strong and black and hot enough to burn his tongue. Evenings were the hardest time. The house felt smaller when they were both inside, the silence heavier when punctuated by the small sounds of 2 people trying not to disturb each other. Clara would sit by the fireplace with some bit of sewing or mending, her needle flashing in the lamplight. Samuel would retreat to the kitchen table with whatever work he could bring inside, cleaning his rifle, oiling leather tack, writing the occasional letter he never intended to send. Sometimes he would watch her from the corner of his eye, noting the way the firelight caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, or how her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked. She had capable hands, he noticed. Not soft like a lady's, but not worn to leather like those of a woman who had known nothing but hard labor. They were the hands of someone who had once lived differently but had adapted to necessity. Clara, for her part, seemed equally aware of his presence without acknowledging it directly. She would glance up when he shifted in his chair or cleared his throat, but always looked away before their eyes could meet. It was as if they had both agreed that direct contact was too dangerous, too likely to upset the delicate balance they had achieved. The nights were a careful choreography of avoidance. Samuel would announce his intention to check on the animals one final time, giving Clara the privacy to prepare for sleep. When he returned, she would be settled on her pallet, facing away from the room, her breathing deep and regular whether she was truly asleep or not. He would bank the fire and retreat to his own small room, where he would lie awake listening to the wind and wondering how his life had become so complicated. It was during the third week of this arrangement that the first crack appeared in their careful distance. Samuel had been working on the barn roof when the ladder shifted beneath him, sending him tumbling to the hard-packed earth below. The fall knocked the wind from his lungs and sent sharp pain shooting through his left shoulder. But it was the sound that brought Clara running, the crash of falling lumber and his involuntary grunt of pain. She found him sitting in the dirt, holding his shoulder and cursing his own carelessness. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the careful boundaries of their coexistence forgotten in the face of immediate need. "Can you move it?" Clara asked, kneeling beside him without hesitation. Samuel tried to lift his arm and winced. "Don't think it's broken. Let me see." Her hands were gentle but firm as she helped him out of his shirt, her touch impersonal as a doctor's as she examined the shoulder. "It's not dislocated, but you've done something to the muscles. You'll need to rest it." "Can't rest it? Too much work to do?" Clara sat back on her heels and gave him a look that reminded him powerfully of his late wife's expression when she thought he was being particularly stubborn. "Mr. Hartwell, that shoulder needs time to heal, or you'll do permanent damage. The work will wait." It was the longest conversation they'd had since that first morning, and Samuel found himself oddly grateful for her practical concern. He allowed her to help him to the house, where she insisted he sit still while she prepared a poultice from herbs she had somehow acquired. "Where did you learn doctoring?" he asked as she worked. "My mother was the closest thing to a doctor in our town," Clara replied, not looking up from her mixing. "I helped her from the time I was old enough to hold bandages steady." It was the first personal information she had volunteered, and Samuel found himself wanting to ask more, but Clara's expression had closed off again, and he sensed that the moment of openness was already passing. For the next few days, Clara insisted on taking over the heavier outdoor work while Samuel's shoulder healed. She proved surprisingly capable with tools, able to finish the fence repairs he had started and even tackle some of the simpler barn maintenance. Samuel found himself watching from the kitchen window as she worked, noting the determined set of her shoulders and the way she refused to let the work defeat her. It was during this time that he began to notice other changes in their routine. Clara would pause in her work to bring him water or check on his shoulder. Samuel, unable to do heavy lifting, took over more of the cooking and cleaning, finding an odd satisfaction in tasks he had previously considered women's work. They began to talk, in small increments. Nothing personal or profound, just the practical communication necessary for two people sharing space and responsibilities. Clara would mention that the chickens seemed restless, suggesting a storm was coming. Samuel would note that they were running low on flour and beans. Simple exchanges, but they felt momentous after weeks of silence. One evening, as Clara sat mending one of Samuel's torn work shirts, he found himself studying her profile in the lamplight. There was something peaceful about the scene, the quiet industry of her hands, the soft sound of the fire settling in the grate, the sense of shared purpose that had somehow developed between them. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Clara looked up, her needle suspended in mid-stitch. "For what? For this? For taking care of things while I couldn't?" She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze returning to her sewing. "You would have done the same," she said finally. Samuel realized she was right, somewhere in the careful dance of their coexistence. He had begun to think of her not as an intruder or a problem to be solved, but as What? A partner? The thought should have alarmed him, but instead, it brought a strange sense of rightness that he wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending sand against the glass like tiny fists demanding entry. But inside, the house felt warm and secure, no longer the refuge of a single desperate man, but something approaching a home. The change began so gradually that neither Samuel nor Clara could have pinpointed when it started. Like the slow shift from summer to autumn, it crept into their shared existence one small gesture at a time, until the house that had once felt divided by invisible walls began to feel like something that might, in time, become a home. It started with the coffee. Clara had always prepared it in the mornings, but now she began leaving Samuel's cup exactly as he liked it, scalding hot and strong enough to strip paint. In return, he found himself rising earlier to ensure the fire was properly banked for warmth when she woke. Neither mentioned these small considerations, but both noticed the kitchen became neutral territory first. They began to move around each other with less awkward awareness. Clara kneading bread while Samuel cleaned his rifle at the table, or Samuel chopping vegetables while Clara tended something on the stove. Their movements developed a rhythm, an unconscious choreography that spoke of growing familiarity. Clara's care for the house extended beyond mere maintenance. Samuel began to notice touches that transformed the stark interior into something warmer. Wildflowers in a cracked pottery jar on the windowsill. Curtains sewn from fabric she must have salvaged or traded for. A braided rug she had somehow created from old rags and placed before the fireplace. The house was still simple, still rough around the edges, but it no longer felt like a shelter. It felt inhabited. For his part, Samuel found himself thinking of Clara's needs as he went about his work. When he repaired the chicken coop, he added a second nesting box so she could gather more eggs. When he rode to the distant creek for water, he brought back smooth stones for her garden borders. He told himself these were practical improvements that benefited them both. But the truth was more complicated than that. The morning Clara's boots finally gave out entirely was the first time Samuel saw her look truly vulnerable. She stood in the kitchen holding the leather sole that had finally separated from the upper, her face a mixture of frustration and despair. "I can patch them again," she said, more to herself than to him. But they both knew the boots were beyond saving. Samuel said nothing. But the next time he rode to the trading post for supplies, he brought back a pair of women's boots, sturdy leather, well made, in a size he had guessed from careful observation of her movements. He left them by the door without comment, as if they had simply appeared there on their own. Clara found them when she went out to feed the chickens. Samuel was working on the corral fence and pretended not to notice when she tried them on, or the way she stood for a long moment looking down at her feet in their new protection. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than usual. "They fit perfectly." "Good," Samuel replied, not looking up from his work. "Can't have you going barefoot in this country." It was Clara's garden that truly began to bring them together. The small plot had expanded under her care, and now provided not just vegetables for their table, but herbs for cooking and medicine. Samuel found himself drawn to watch her work, fascinated by her knowledge of plants and their uses. "My grandmother taught me," Clara explained one evening as she hung bundles of sage to dry. "She said a woman who could grow her own food and heal her own family would never be truly helpless." It was the most she had ever told him about her past, and Samuel treasured the confidence. In return, he began sharing his own knowledge: how to read the weather and the behavior of animals, where to find the best water in dry country, which plants the cattle could eat safely and which would make them sick. Their conversations, when they happened, remained practical and brief, but they carried an undercurrent of something deeper. They were learning to trust each other, not with grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but with the small, daily acts of consideration that made shared life possible. The night Clara fell ill with fever was a turning point neither of them expected. Samuel woke to the sound of her restless tossing by the fireplace, and found her burning with heat and shivering uncontrollably. For a moment, he was transported back to the terrible nights when Martha and James had been dying, and his first instinct was to retreat, to protect himself from the pain of watching another person slip away. But Clara was not Martha, and this was not the same fever that had destroyed his family. This was something he could fight. He spent the night alternating between cooling her burning skin with damp cloths and building up the fire when the chills took her. He brewed the teas she had taught him to make from her dried herbs, holding her head while she drank them down. When she became delirious and called out for her mother, he spoke to her in the same gentle tones he had once used with his son. "You're safe," he told her. "I'm here. You're going to be all right." By morning, the fever had broken, leaving Clara weak but coherent. She woke to find Samuel asleep in the chair beside her pallet, his hand still resting on her forehead as if monitoring her temperature. The sight of this careful, guarded man who had chosen to care for her instead of simply letting the fever run its course brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Samuel stirred and opened his eyes, immediately alert. "How do you feel?" "Better, weak, but better." Clara struggled to sit up, and Samuel moved to help her, his touch gentle and impersonal. "You didn't have to stay with me." "Yes, I did." The words came out more forcefully than Samuel had intended, and he saw Clara's eyes widen slightly at his vehemence. "I mean, you would have done the same." Clara studied his face, seeing something there that made her heart flutter unexpectedly. "Would I?" Samuel met her gaze steadily. "You're not the kind of person who abandons someone in need. I've learned that much about you." It was perhaps the closest either of them had come to acknowledging that they knew each other as more than reluctant housemates. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and precious as spun glass. As Clara recovered her strength over the following days, the dynamic between them shifted subtly but unmistakably. Samuel found excuses to check on her more frequently, bringing her extra blankets or hot soup without being asked. Clara, for her part, began to leave small tokens of appreciation around the house. His favorite shirt mended with unusual care, a plate of the molasses cookies she somehow knew he preferred, his coffee cup warmed by the fire each morning before he woke. The afternoon Samuel found Clara struggling to lift a heavy bucket of water from the well. He didn't hesitate to take it from her hands, but instead of simply carrying it to the house as he had done before, he paused to show her a better way to draw water that wouldn't strain her back. "Like this," he said, standing behind her and guiding her hands on the rope. "Let the pulley do the work." Clara was acutely aware of his presence, the warmth of his chest against her back, the gentle strength of his hands over hers, the way his voice rumbled close to her ear. It was the first time he had touched her with anything approaching tenderness, and she found herself leaning back into his solid presence almost without thinking. Samuel, too, was affected by the contact, the scent of her hair, the way she fit naturally within the circle of his arms, the trust implicit in her willingness to let him guide her. All of it combined to create a moment of perfect rightness that neither wanted to end. When Clara finally mastered the technique, they separated slowly, both suddenly aware of what had just passed between them. Samuel cleared his throat and stepped back, his face carefully neutral. "That should make it easier," he said. "Yes," Clara agreed, her voice slightly breathless. "Much easier." But they both knew they weren't talking about drawing water anymore. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, the silence between them felt different, charged with possibility rather than wariness. Clara worked on her eternal mending while Samuel cleaned his gun, but both were hyper-aware of the other's presence. "Samuel," Clara said suddenly, then stopped, as if surprised by her own boldness in using his given name. He looked up from his gun, giving her his full attention. "Yes? I thank you for everything, for letting me stay, for taking care of me when I was sick, for..." She gestured helplessly. unable to put into words all the small kindnesses that had accumulated between them. Samuel set down his gun and leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "Clara, I need you to know something. When I first came here, I thought I wanted to be alone. I thought that was the only way I could survive what had happened to me. But you've shown me that surviving and living aren't the same thing." Clara's needle stilled in her hands. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that this house is better with you in it. I'm better with you in it." Samuel's voice was rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel, let alone express. "I don't know what that means for the future, but I know I don't want you to leave." Clara set down her sewing and looked at him directly, her brown eyes soft with understanding. "I don't want to leave either. Samuel, this is the first place that's ever felt like home to me." Outside, the wind picked up as it did most evenings, but inside their small adobe house, two wounded souls had found something neither had dared to hope for, a place where they could begin to heal, together. The blizzard came without warning, as the worst storms often do in that harsh country. Samuel had noticed the peculiar stillness in the air that morning, the way the cattle huddled closer together than usual, but nothing had prepared him for the wall of white that swept down from the mountains just after noon. One moment Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, and the next she was fighting her way through swirling snow that stung like needles and made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Samuel found her by following the sound of her voice calling his name, half frozen and completely disoriented. Clutching an armload of shirts she'd refused to abandon even in the face of the storm. Get inside," he shouted over the howling wind, taking her arm and guiding her toward the house. "This is going to be a bad one." They barely made it to the door before the full fury of the storm hit. The wind drove snow through every crack and crevice, and the temperature dropped so quickly that the water in the basin began to form ice at the edges within minutes. Samuel had seen blizzards before, but nothing quite like this. It was as if nature had decided to remind them just how small and vulnerable they really were. For 3 days, the storm raged without pause. Samuel kept the fire burning constantly, feeding it with wood from the dwindling pile beside the hearth and rationing their supply carefully. The windows were completely covered with snow, turning the small house into a cave lit only by firelight and the occasional flicker of the oil lamp. On the second day, Clara began to cough. At first, Samuel thought it was just the effect of the smoke and close air, but by evening her breathing had become labored and her skin felt warm to the touch. When she tried to hide her condition by turning away when the coughing fits seized her, he knew they were in serious trouble. "It's nothing," she insisted when he approached with a worried expression. "Just a little cold from getting caught in the snow." But Samuel had seen this before. The fever that started small and grew, the way breath came short and painful, the flush in the cheeks that spoke of the body's desperate fight against infection. He'd lost his wife and son to something that had started just this way, and the memories came flooding back with a clarity that made his hands shake. "Let me help you," he said, kneeling beside her pallet by the fire. "I'm fine, truly," Clara began, but the words dissolved into another violent coughing fit that left her gasping and weak. Samuel didn't wait for permission. He scooped her up in his arms, surprised by how light she felt, and carried her to his own bed in the small back room. Clara was too sick to protest, and too grateful for the softer mattress and warmer blankets to argue about propriety. That night, Samuel kept vigil beside the bed, alternating between building up the fire in the main room and returning to check on Clara's condition. Her fever climbed steadily, and with it came the delirium that he remembered with terrible clarity from those last nights with Martha and James. "Mama?" Clara called out in her sleep, her voice small and frightened. "Mama, where are you?" Samuel dampened a cloth in the basin of snow water he'd brought inside and placed it gently on her forehead. "Shh," he murmured. "You're safe. Just rest." But Clara was lost in whatever fever dream had claimed her, and her agitation grew worse as the night wore on. She tossed restlessly, throwing off the blankets despite her chills, and muttered words that Samuel couldn't quite make out. Sometimes she seemed to be arguing with someone, her voice gaining strength and defiance even in her weakened state. "I won't go back," she said clearly at one point, her eyes open but unfocused. "You can't make me. I won't be his property anymore." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. The fragments of her past that she'd never shared were spilling out in her delirium, painting a picture that made his chest tighten with protective anger. Someone had hurt her, badly, and she'd fled to this isolated place to escape them. As the hours passed, Samuel found himself talking to her in the same gentle tones he'd once used with his son during the long nights of illness. He told her about the ranch, about the work they'd done together, about how the garden would look in spring. He spoke of anything that might anchor her to the present and pull her back from whatever dark memories the fever had awakened. "You're not alone," he told her as dawn approached and her fever seemed to peak. "I'm here, Clara. I'm not going anywhere." It was then that she opened her eyes and looked at him with a sudden, startling clarity. For a moment, Samuel thought the fever had broken, but then she spoke in a voice so raw with pain that it made his heart ache. "He said I belonged to him," she whispered. "Like a horse or a piece of furniture. Said my father owed him money, and I was payment for the debt." Samuel felt his hands clench into fists. "Who said that?" "Mr. Bartholomew. He owns half the county where I grew up, maybe more. When Papa died, Mama couldn't pay what was owed, so he—" Clara's voice broke. "He was going to make me his wife. Said it was that or see Mama thrown out with nothing." The words came out in a rush, as if the fever had burned away all the careful barriers she'd built around her past. Samuel listened without interruption, his face growing darker with each detail she revealed. "I tried to tell myself it would be all right, that I could learn to live with it, for Mama's sake. But then I saw the way he looked at me, the way he talked about what he expected from a wife, and I knew I couldn't. I'd rather die in the desert than live as his possession." "So you ran," Samuel said quietly. Clara nodded weakly. "In the middle of the night, with nothing but the clothes on my back and what little money I could find, I knew he'd come after me. So I had to go somewhere he'd never think to look, somewhere so remote that even if he did find me, it wouldn't be worth the trouble to drag me back." Samuel reached out and took her hand, feeling how small and cold it was in his own weathered palm. "You did the right thing." "Did I?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Mama's probably lost everything by now. She's probably on the streets, and it's my fault for being too selfish to sacrifice myself for her security." "No." Samuel's voice was firm, cutting through her guilt like a blade. "You can't blame yourself for refusing to be treated like property. No person should have to live that way, no matter what's owed or to whom." Clara stared at him with wonder, as if she'd never heard anyone speak those words before. "You really believe that?" "I believe that you're worth more than any debt, real or imagined," Samuel said simply. "And I believe that any man who would force a woman into marriage against her will isn't worthy of the name." The conversation seemed to exhaust Clara, and she closed her eyes again. But her breathing was easier now, more natural. The fever continued through the day, but Samuel felt as if some invisible weight had been lifted from both of them by her confession. When evening came, Samuel realized he owed her the same honesty she'd given him. As she dozed fitfully, he began to speak in low tones, telling her things he'd never said aloud to another living soul. "I had a family once," he began. "A wife named Martha and a son named James. Martha was everything good in the world, kind, patient, stronger than she looked. James was just 7, with his mother's eyes and a laugh that could make you forget your troubles." Clara's breathing changed slightly, and Samuel knew she was listening even though her eyes remained closed. "The fever came through our town like wildfire. Took whole families in a matter of days. I tried everything, doctors, medicine, prayers. Nothing worked. I watched them die by inches, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop it." Samuel's voice cracked with old pain. "When it was over, I couldn't stand to be around other people. Couldn't stand their sympathy or their relief that it hadn't been their family. So I sold everything and came here to die quietly. But you didn't die, Clara whispered, her eyes still closed. No, Samuel agreed. I didn't die. I just existed. Until you showed up and reminded me what it felt like to care about someone again. Clara's eyes opened then, and she looked at him with such depth of understanding that Samuel felt as if she could see straight through to his soul. Are you sorry that I reminded you? Samuel considered the question seriously, thinking about the fear that had gripped him when he'd seen her falling ill, the way his hands had shaken with the memory of other losses. Then he thought about the warmth that had slowly crept into his life over the past months, the sense of purpose that came from having someone to care for and protect. No, he said finally. I'm not sorry. Caring hurts sometimes, but the alternative is no life at all. Clara smiled weakly, and Samuel saw something in her expression that made his heart skip. It was trust, pure and simple. The kind of trust that only came when someone had seen you at your worst and chosen to stay anyway. By the third morning, both the storm and Clara's fever had broken. Samuel woke from an uneasy doze in the chair beside the bed to find her sitting up, weak but lucid, looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time. How long was I sick? She asked. 3 days, Samuel replied, stretching the kinks out of his neck. You gave me quite a scare. Clara looked down at her hands, and Samuel could see her remembering the things she'd told him in her delirium. I said things. You told me the truth, Samuel said gently. And I'm glad you did. No one should have to carry burdens like that alone. Outside, the sun was shining on a world transformed by snow, brilliant and clean and new. Inside their small house, 2 people who had begun as strangers had found something neither had dared to hope for. Someone who understood their pain and chose to share their burdens anyway. The storm had passed, but it had left them changed in ways that would echo through all the days to come. Spring had come early that year, painting the desert in unexpected colors. Clara's garden was thriving, and Samuel had managed to expand their small herd by trading work with a neighboring rancher, for the first time since either of them could remember. Life felt hopeful. The careful distance they had once maintained had given way to an easy partnership, and though neither had spoken of love directly, it lived in the small gestures that filled their days, the way Clara hummed while she worked, the gentle way Samuel's hand would brush hers when he helped with evening chores. It was on a Tuesday morning in late April that their peace was shattered. Samuel was mending harness in the barn when he heard the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders, coming fast across the hard-packed earth. In this isolated country, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble, and the urgency in the hoofbeats set every instinct Samuel possessed on high alert. He set down his tools and reached for the rifle he always kept close, checking to ensure it was loaded before moving to the barn door. Through the gap in the weathered boards, he could see 4 men on horseback approaching the house, even at a distance. There was something predatory about the way they moved, like wolves circling prey. The man in the lead was well dressed by frontier standards, wearing a black coat and hat that marked him as someone with money and position. His horse was fine-bred, too good for rough country travel unless the journey was important enough to justify the risk. Behind him rode 3 harder men, hired guns, Samuel realized, recognizing the type from his years in more populated areas. Clara had been hanging laundry behind the house, but she must have heard the horses too. Samuel saw her emerge from around the corner, a wet sheet still clutched in her hands. The moment she saw the riders, she went absolutely still, her face draining of all color. Even from 50 yards away, Samuel could see her terror. The lead rider dismounted with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He was tall and well-fed, with graying hair and the kind of face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness in his pale eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the yard. "Clara, my dear, you've led me quite a chase." Samuel felt his blood turn to ice. This was Bartholomew, the man who had driven Clara to flee everything she'd ever known, the man who considered her his property. "Mr. Bartholomew," Clara's voice was barely above a whisper, but there was steel beneath the fear. "You have no business here." Bartholomew smiled, and the expression was worse than any scowl would have been. "On the contrary, my dear, I have every business wherever my property happens to be, and you, as we both know, belong to me." "I belong to no one," Clara said, lifting her chin with a defiance that made Samuel's heart swell with pride, even as his finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle. "Your father's debts say otherwise." Bartholomew's tone remained conversational, but there was menace underneath it. $47.32, to be precise, plus interest, of course, and the considerable expense I've incurred tracking you down. Your mother was most helpful in providing information about your possible whereabouts." Clara flinched as if she'd been struck. "What did you do to her?" "Nothing permanent," Bartholomew replied with mock reassurance. "She's merely enjoying my hospitality while we sort out this unfortunate misunderstanding. I'm sure she'll be much more comfortable once you return to fulfill your obligations." Samuel had heard enough. He stepped out of the barn, rifle held ready but not yet aimed directly at the visitors. The sound of his boots on the hard ground drew all eyes to him, and he saw Bartholomew's expression shift from confident satisfaction to annoyed calculation. "You gentlemen seem to be lost," Samuel said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that spoke of a man comfortable with violence when necessary. "This is private property." Bartholomew's three companions shifted restlessly in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons, but their leader merely smiled that cold smile again. "Mr. he prompted. "Hartwell, Samuel Hartwell, and you're trespassing." "Ah, Mr. Hartwell, I'm Jeremiah Bartholomew, and I'm here to collect what's mine." Bartholomew gestured toward Clara as if she were a stray cow. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. This young woman is promised to me in marriage to settle her family's debts. She's run away from her responsibilities." "I see no young woman here who wishes to go anywhere with you," Samuel replied evenly. Bartholomew's smile faltered slightly. "Perhaps you don't understand the situation. Mr. Hartwell, this is a legal matter. Clara's father signed a binding agreement." "I understand plenty," Samuel interrupted, taking a step forward. "I understand that no person can be property, legal papers or not. I understand that the lady has made her choice clear, and I understand that you and your men need to leave my land now." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Samuel could feel the weight of 4 pairs of eyes measuring him, calculating odds and advantages. Clara stood frozen between them, her face pale but determined. Bartholomew's mask of civility finally began to slip. "This doesn't concern you, Hartwell. Walk away, and no one gets hurt." "Everything concerning Clara concerns me," Samuel said, and the simple declaration seemed to ring across the empty desert like a bell. "She's under my protection." "Your protection?" Bartholomew laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Look around. Man, you're outnumbered and outgunned. What protection could you possibly offer?" Samuel's grip on his rifle remained steady. "The kind that puts you in the ground if you try to take her." For the first time, Bartholomew looked genuinely angry. The pretense of civilized discourse evaporated like morning mist, revealing the brutal man beneath. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," he snarled. "I own half the territory we rode through to get here. I have judges and sheriffs in my pocket from here to Santa Fe. You're nobody, a broken-down homesteader in the middle of nowhere. And she's a runaway debtor who belongs to me by law. Your law doesn't reach here," Samuel replied. "And even if it did, I wouldn't let you take her." Bartholomew dismounted fully now, and his 3 hired guns followed suit. The choreography was practiced, professional, the movements of men who had done this before. "Clara," Bartholomew called, his voice taking on a different tone, wheedling, manipulative. "Be reasonable. My dear, look at what you've reduced yourself to. Living in squalor with a stranger, grubbing in the dirt like a common farmhand. I'm offering you respectability, security, a proper home. All you have to do is honor your father's commitment." Clara stepped forward, And Samuel was amazed to see that her fear had transformed into something harder, more dangerous. "My father's commitment died with him," she said clearly. "And even if it hadn't, I would rather die in this desert than spend one day as your wife." Bartholomew's face darkened with rage. "Ungrateful girl, do you think this nobody can protect you? He's one man with an old rifle, and I have resources you can't imagine. If you don't come willingly, I'll simply take you, and your protector here will learn what happens to men who interfere with my business." Samuel felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest, the same icy calm that had carried him through the war, through the loss of his family, through all the hard times that had brought him to this isolated place. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Mister, you just made a mistake. You threatened her, and you threatened me. In my experience, men who make threats like that usually can't back them up." "Is that so?" Bartholomew gestured to his men. "Well, let's just see about that." The three gunmen spread out in a practiced formation, but Samuel had been watching them carefully. They were dangerous, but they were also overconfident. They saw an isolated farmer and his woman, not the former soldier who had survived battles that would have broken lesser men. "Last chance," Samuel said. His rifle still held it ready but not yet aimed. "Mount up and ride out, or things are going to get unpleasant." Bartholomew's laugh was harsh and grating. "You're delusional if you think—" The sound of Clara's voice cut through his words like a blade. "Samuel." He glanced at her briefly, saw the absolute trust in her eyes, the unwavering faith that he would not let them take her. In that moment, Samuel understood that everything he had lost, everything he had suffered, had led him to this place and this choice. Clara wasn't just the woman who had refused to leave his house. She was his family, his future, his reason for fighting. "She's mine," Bartholomew said, his voice rising with frustrated anger. "By law and by right, she belongs to me. No broken-down nobody is going to—" "She belongs to herself," Samuel said firmly, finally raising his rifle to point directly at Bartholomew's chest. "And she's chosen to stay here, with me. That makes her family." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and threat. Samuel saw understanding dawn in Bartholomew's eyes, the realization that this wasn't going to be the simple retrieval he had planned. "Family," Samuel repeated, his voice carrying across the desert silence. "And I protect my family." The confrontation hung balanced on a knife's edge. 4 armed men against 1, with Clara standing witness to whatever would come next. But in Samuel's steady gaze and unwavering stance, Bartholomew began to see something that gave him pause, the absolute certainty of a man who had already lost everything once and would not allow it to happen again. The standoff stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Samuel could feel the weight of the moment, the way everything in his life had led to this confrontation in the dusty yard of a ranch in the middle of nowhere. 4 armed men against 1. But he had faced worse odds before and survived. More importantly, he had something worth fighting for again. Bartholomew's cold eyes flicked between Samuel and Clara, calculating his options. The hired guns flanking him were professionals, but they were also waiting for orders. Samuel could see the tension in their stance, the way their hands hovered near their weapons without quite drawing them. They were dangerous, but they weren't stupid. A fight here would be costly, and they knew it. "You're making a mistake, Hartwell," Bartholomew said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "A very expensive mistake. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" "A man who thinks money gives him the right to own people," Samuel replied evenly. "I've met your kind before." Clara stepped forward, moving closer to Samuel's side. The gesture was small but unmistakable, a clear declaration of where her loyalty lay. "Mr. Bartholomew, you heard what he said. I'm not going anywhere with you. Not now. Not ever." Bartholomew's face darkened further. "Clara, you're being foolish. This arrangement you have here isn't legal. You're not married to this man, which means you're living in sin. When word gets out, and it will, your reputation will be ruined forever. My reputation is my own concern. Clara said firmly. "And I'd rather be ruined in my own eyes than owned by you." The words seemed to hit Bartholomew like a physical blow. Samuel could see the man's composure cracking, the civilized mask slipping away to reveal something uglier underneath. "You ungrateful little—" Bartholomew caught himself, forcing his voice back to a more controlled tone. "Very well. If that's how you want to play this game, we can discuss terms. Hartwell, I'm a reasonable man. Name your price." Samuel felt disgust rise in his throat. "She's not for sale." "Everything's for sale," Bartholomew countered. "The only question is price. $100? $200? Surely a man in your circumstances could use the money." The offer hung in the air like poison. Samuel saw one of the hired guns shift slightly, perhaps thinking the negotiation was about to take a more profitable turn. But Samuel's expression never changed. "There isn't enough money in the territory," he said quietly. Bartholomew studied Samuel's face and seemed to recognize something there that made him recalculate his approach. When he spoke again, his tone carried a different kind of threat. "You know, Hartwell, this country can be dangerous for a man living alone. Accidents happen, fires start, wells get poisoned. It would be a shame if something unfortunate befell your homestead after I leave." Samuel felt the familiar cold calm settle over him, the same feeling that had carried him through battles and grief and all the long, hard years since. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Is that a threat, Bartholomew? It's a fact of life in this territory. A man needs friends, allies, people who wish him well. I have many such friends. You, on the other hand—" Bartholomew shrugged eloquently. "I have everything I need," Samuel replied, his grip shifting slightly on his rifle. Clara moved again, this time placing her hand on Samuel's arm. The touch was light, but he could feel her strength, her determination. She wasn't cowering behind him. She was standing with him. "Mr. Bartholomew," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "You've come a long way for nothing. I'm not the frightened girl who ran away in the night. That girl is gone, and she's never coming back. You think this man can protect you?" Bartholomew gestured dismissively at Samuel. "One rifle against the resources I can bring to bear? You're deluding yourself." "Maybe," Clara acknowledged. "But I'd rather face whatever you can send than spend one day as your wife. I've found something here worth fighting for, something worth dying for, if necessary." Samuel felt his heart skip at her words. He glanced at her briefly, seeing the absolute certainty in her brown eyes, the unwavering resolve that had first drawn him to her. Bartholomew seemed to sense that the situation was slipping beyond his control. His voice took on a wheedling tone, the words of a man accustomed to getting his way through manipulation when force failed. "Clara, be reasonable. Look at what you're choosing. This hovel in the desert, a life of back-breaking labor. No society, no comfort, no security. I'm offering you a mansion, servants, fine clothes, everything a woman could want. Everything except freedom." Clara replied, "Everything except the right to choose my own path." "Freedom?" Bartholomew laughed harshly. "What freedom does a woman have in this world? At least with me. You'd be protected, provided for. Here, you're one disaster away from destitution." Clara's chin lifted with a pride that made Samuel's chest swell with admiration. "I'd rather face disaster as a free woman than live in luxury as property." The words seemed to break something in Bartholomew's restraint. His face flushed with anger, and his hand moved toward the gun at his side. "Enough! I've wasted enough time on this charade. Boys!" Samuel's rifle swung up with deadly precision, the barrel finding Bartholomew's chest before the man could complete his draw. The movement was so smooth, so practiced, that it spoke of years of experience and countless hours of training. "I wouldn't," Samuel said calmly. The three hired guns tensed, their own hands moving toward their weapons, but they hesitated when they saw the steady way Samuel held his rifle, the complete lack of fear or uncertainty in his stance. This wasn't a farmer playing at being tough. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "You pull that trigger," and my boys will cut you down," Bartholomew said. But there was less certainty in his voice now. "Maybe," Samuel agreed. "But you'll be dead before I hit the ground, and I'm betting your boys aren't paid enough to die for your wounded pride." One of the hired guns, a lean man with a scar running down his left cheek, spoke up for the first time. "Boss, maybe we should think about this. The man's got the drop on you, and he don't look like he's bluffing." "Shut up, Carson," Bartholomew snapped, but Samuel could see doubt creeping into his eyes. Clara stepped forward again, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "It's over, Mr. Bartholomew. I've made my choice, and Samuel has made his. You can accept that and ride away, or you can try to take me by force and see how that works out for you." The standoff stretched for another long moment. The only sound the whisper of wind across the desert and the restless shifting of horses. Samuel kept his rifle trained on Bartholomew's chest, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He had killed before, in the war, and he would kill again if necessary to protect Clara. Finally, Bartholomew seemed to realize that his position was untenable. The cold calculation that had driven him this far finally overcame his anger and wounded pride. Slowly, carefully, he raised his hands away from his gun. "This isn't over," he said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "I have resources, connections. I can make life very difficult for you both." "You can try," Samuel replied. "But Clara stays here. That's not negotiable." Bartholomew's eyes burned with fury, but he was smart enough to recognize when he'd been beaten, at least for the moment. He stepped back toward his horse, his movements careful and deliberate. "You're making enemies you can't afford. Hartwell," he said as he swung up into the saddle. "Both of you. This territory isn't big enough to hide from me forever." "Then maybe you should find yourself a different territory," Samuel suggested, his rifle still trained on the mounted man. Bartholomew gathered his reins, his face a mask of cold anger. "Carson, Murphy, Williams, mount up. We're leaving." The three hired guns obeyed, but Samuel could see the reluctance in their movements. They had expected an easy job. Ride out, collect a runaway woman, collect their pay. Instead, they'd found themselves facing a man who clearly knew how to handle himself in a fight. As they prepared to ride out, Bartholomew made one final attempt. "Clara, last chance. Come with me now, and I'll forget this unfortunate incident. Stay here, and you'll regret it for whatever short life you have left." Clara moved to stand beside Samuel, her shoulder touching his arm. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying across the desert air with absolute finality. "I've already made my choice. This is my home. Samuel is my family, and I'll die before I let you take me away from either one." Samuel felt something profound shift inside his chest at her words. Family. She had called him family, and in that moment, he understood that she meant it with every fiber of her being. The broken, isolated man who had come to this place to die alone had found something he'd never expected to find again, a reason to live, and someone worth living for. Bartholomew stared at them for a long moment, taking in the picture they made standing together against him. Then, without another word, he wheeled his horse around and spurred it into a gallop. His three men followed, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they rode hard across the desert. Samuel kept his rifle ready until the riders were mere specks on the horizon, then finally lowered it. The silence that followed felt different from the tense quiet of the confrontation. It felt like peace. Clara turned to face him, and Samuel saw tears streaming down her cheeks. But they weren't tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something deeper that made his heart race. "Thank you," she whispered. Samuel set his rifle aside and reached out to gently wipe the tears from her face. "You don't need to thank me. You said it yourself. Your family." Clara smiled through her tears, and the expression transformed her entire face. "Is that what we are?" Samuel considered the question, thinking about all the careful barriers they had built and torn down, all the small gestures and growing trust that had brought them to this moment. "I think," he said slowly, "we're whatever we choose to be." Clara stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "Then I choose you, Samuel Hartwell. I choose this place, this life, this chance we've found together." Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion he'd thought he'd lost forever. "And I choose you, Clara Whitmore, for whatever comes next." They stood together in the desert silence. Two people who had found each other against all odds and chosen to build something new from the ashes of their old lives. The threat wasn't over. Bartholomew would likely return, and there would be other challenges ahead, but they would face them together, as family, as partners, as whatever they chose to become in this vast, unforgiving, beautiful land they now called home. 3 years had passed since Bartholomew's dust had settled on the horizon, and the ranch had transformed from a lonely outpost into something that could truly be called a home. The changes hadn't come all at once. They had accumulated like layers of sediment, each season building upon the last until the place bore little resemblance to the sparse refuge Samuel had first purchased. The house itself had grown. What had once been a simple adobe structure now boasted a proper kitchen addition, complete with a real iron stove that Samuel had hauled in piece by piece from Santa Fe. Clara had insisted they needed more space for when folks come calling, though Samuel suspected her real motivation was the way her eyes lit up when she talked about someday filling those extra rooms with the sounds of children. The barn had been rebuilt entirely, its sturdy frame housing not just Samuel's original horse and cattle, but a small herd that now numbered nearly 30 head. Clara had proven to have an unexpected talent for animal husbandry, and under her care, their livestock had flourished in ways that surprised even Samuel. She had a gentle touch with the newborn calves and an intuitive understanding of when an animal was ailing. But it was Clara's garden that truly showed the passage of time and the depth of her commitment to this place. What had begun as a small plot of struggling vegetables had expanded into a verdant oasis that provided not only food for their table, but herbs for medicine, flowers for beauty, and even a small orchard of fruit trees that Samuel had brought back from one of his supply runs to town. The work had been hard, but it had been shared work, and that had made all the difference. Samuel would rise before dawn to tend the cattle while Clara prepared breakfast, and they would meet at the kitchen table as the sun painted the distant mountains gold. Their conversations had evolved from the careful exchanges of wary strangers to the comfortable rhythms of people who knew each other's thoughts almost before they were spoken. "The Hendersons are coming by today," Clara mentioned one morning in late spring, pouring coffee into Samuel's cup with the unconscious grace of long practice. "Mary's expecting again, and she wants to ask about those herbs I gave her for the morning sickness." Samuel nodded, unsurprised. Word of Clara's skill with medicinal plants had spread among the scattered families in the territory, and their kitchen table had become an informal gathering place for neighbors seeking advice or simply human companionship. It was a development that would have horrified the solitude-seeking man Samuel had been. But the man he had become found genuine pleasure in Clara's happiness when she was able to help others. "She mention how far along she is?" Samuel asked, remembering his own wife's pregnancies with a pang that was now more bittersweet than purely painful. "About 4 months, I think. Her third." Clara's voice carried a note of wistful longing that Samuel had learned to recognize. They had never spoken directly about children of their own, but the subject hung between them like morning mist, delicate and full of possibility. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his thoughts, and Samuel glanced through the window to see a small wagon making its way across the desert toward their home. But it wasn't the Hendersons. It was a larger group, and something about their purposeful approach made Samuel reach for the rifle he still kept close at hand, old habits dying hard. Clara noticed his tension and moved to look out the window herself. "It's all right," she said after a moment, her voice carrying relief. "It's the Morales family from the South Valley, and they've got Father Miguel with them." Samuel relaxed, recognizing the priest who occasionally made circuits through the scattered settlements, performing marriages, baptisms, and other sacraments for families too isolated to make regular trips to town. Father Miguel was a good man, practical and unpretentious, who understood that frontier life required a certain flexibility in matters of doctrine and procedure. As the wagon drew closer, Samuel could see that it carried not just the Morales family, but several other neighbors as well, the kind of gathering that usually meant some sort of celebration or important announcement. Clara went to the door to greet them, her face bright with curiosity and welcome. "Buenos dias, Clara," called out Miguel Morales as he helped his wife down from the wagon. "We bring news, and Father Miguel has something to ask you both." The priest, a spare man in his 60s, with kind eyes and hands weathered by years of hard travel, approached with a smile. "Samuel, Clara, it's good to see you both looking so well. I trust you won't mind an unexpected visit?" "Never," Clara assured him. "Come in, all of you. I'll put coffee on." As their neighbors filed into the house, Samuel found himself marveling at how natural this felt, how their home had become a place where people gathered, where community happened. It was so far from the isolated existence he had planned that sometimes he could hardly believe this was his life. Father Miguel accepted a cup of Clara's coffee and settled into the chair by the fireplace with the ease of a man accustomed to finding comfort wherever he could. "I have to say, this place looks wonderful. Last time I was through here, it was just you, Samuel, and you looked like a man who had given up on the world." "Things change," Samuel replied simply, glancing at Clara as she bustled about serving their guests. "Indeed they do." Father Miguel's eyes twinkled with gentle humor. "Which brings me to why I'm here. It's come to my attention that you two have been living together for some time now. And while I'm not one to judge the choices people make in difficult circumstances, I think it might be time to consider making your arrangement official." Clara paused in her serving, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. Samuel felt his own face grow warm as he realized what the priest was suggesting. "Father," Clara began, but Miguel Morales interrupted with a laugh. "Clara, everyone for 50 miles knows you two are devoted to each other. The way you look at each other, the way you work together, the way you've built this place into something beautiful. It's clear as day that you're already married in every way that matters. Father Miguel is just offering to make it official in the eyes of God and the law." Samuel looked at Clara, seeing the hope and uncertainty warring in her expression. They had never discussed marriage formally, though their lives had become so intertwined that the distinction between courtship and marriage had seemed largely academic. But he realized now that making it official would mean something to her, would give her a security and recognition that their current arrangement, however loving, could not provide. "Clara," he said quietly, setting down his coffee and moving to stand before her. "What do you think?" She looked up at him with those brown eyes that had first challenged him to be better than he thought he could be. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like very much to be your wife. Samuel Hartwell, officially and completely." The room erupted in pleased murmurs and congratulations from their neighbors. But Samuel was only aware of Clara's face, of the way her smile seemed to light up the entire room. He reached out and took her hands in his, marveling at how small and strong they were, how perfectly they fit in his own weathered palms. "Then let's do it right," he said. "Father Miguel, would you be willing to perform the ceremony? Today?" The priest beamed. "Nothing would give me greater pleasure. Maria," he called to Mrs. Morales, "did you bring that dress like I asked you to?" Clara looked confused until Maria Morales produced a wrapped bundle from the wagon. "It was my daughter's wedding dress," she explained. "She's married and living in California now, and when Father Miguel told us what he had in mind, we thought you might like to borrow it." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she unwrapped the bundle to reveal a simple but beautiful white dress, hand-sewn with delicate embroidery along the bodice. "I can't. It's too beautiful." "Nonsense," Maria said firmly. "Every bride deserves a proper dress, and this one needs to see another wedding." Rosa would be honored to know it was being used. The next hour passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Clara disappeared into the bedroom with Maria and the other women to change into the dress. while Samuel found himself being fussed over by the men, who insisted on helping him into his best shirt and brushing the dust from his hat. When Clara emerged from the bedroom, Samuel felt his breath catch in his throat. The dress fit her perfectly, and with her hair braided with wildflowers that one of the neighbor children had gathered, she looked beautiful beyond words. But more than that, she looked happy, radiantly, completely happy in a way that made Samuel's chest tight with emotion. They stood together in their small kitchen, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends, and spoke vows that felt both deeply familiar and startlingly new. Samuel promised to love and protect Clara for all the days of his life, and she promised to stand by him through whatever trials might come. When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared tasted of coffee and tears and the promise of all the mornings yet to come. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Maria had brought food. Someone produced a fiddle, and their small house rang with laughter and music until well after sunset. Samuel found himself dancing with his new wife in the kitchen where they had shared so many quiet meals, spinning her around while their friends clapped and called out encouragement. Late that night, after their guests had departed and the house was quiet again, Samuel and Clara sat on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. Clara had changed out of the wedding dress but still wore the wildflowers in her hair, and Samuel thought he had never seen anything more beautiful. "Do you think we would have found each other if I hadn't been so stubborn about staying?" Clara asked, her head resting on Samuel's shoulder. Samuel considered the question, thinking about the man he had been when he first arrived at this place, broken, angry, determined to shut out the world and everyone in it. "I don't know," he admitted. "I was pretty set on being alone." "What changed your mind?" Samuel wrapped his arm around his wife. His wife. The word still seemed miraculous, and pulled her closer. "You did. You refused to let me disappear, even when I wanted to. You reminded me that being alive and being human aren't the same thing." Clara smiled and lifted her hand to touch his cheek. "You saved me too, from Bartholomew. Yes, but also from believing that I had to choose between safety and freedom. You showed me I could have both." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert and feeling the solid presence of the home they had built together. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and Clara laughed softly. "Even they have found someone," she said. Samuel kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair and wildflowers. "Seems like this desert's a good place for that. Finding someone. I mean, the best place," Clara agreed. Who would have thought that nowhere could become everywhere? Samuel looked out at the land that stretched endlessly around them, harsh, unforgiving, beautiful beyond measure. Once he had come here to die quietly, to disappear from a world that had taken everything he loved. Instead, he had found Clara, and she had given him back his life, his purpose, his belief in tomorrow. The ranch in the middle of nowhere had become their everywhere, and Samuel Hartwell was finally, completely home.